Hey, this is Jeff Nyquist, and it's another edition of Friends and Enemies. And I'm here with Alex Benesch in Germany. He's in Germany, I'm in the United States, and we're here to discuss strategy, foreign policy, espionage history, Cold War history. Alex, I understand this week Henry Kissinger, age 100, died this week.
Yeah, we know him as Heinz Alfred Kissinger, and he's basically from right around the corner here. He played soccer not very well, and then he fled. He fled to the United States with his family, and they were quite. And they had the advantage with that one because they had a relative in the United States to vouch for them. And so they could escape, but quite a few family members stayed behind. And according to historians, roughly 30 family members died in concentration camps. So that's the backstory in a nutshell.
And Henry Kissinger was of a German Jewish extraction.
Yeah.
And of course he became Nixon's famously national security advisor in 1969, and then was moved up to be Secretary of State, which he was through the rest of the Nixon and Ford administrations. And then, of course, many of the leading people in U.S. foreign policy were trained and brought up by Kissinger, including CIA Chief and Defense Secretary Robert Gates. And General Scowcroft, and of course General Al Haig
Yeah.
Jr., among the more prominent, who was also Secretary of State initially in the first Reagan administration. So Kissinger had tremendous influence, and of course he was, I guess you would say, I mean, when I read many of his books when I was younger, Kissinger was the American political scientist. Of course, he wasn't actually American political scientist par excellence. He mastered the actual thought process of an American political scientist, and his books reflect this ability, this understanding of political science, which was really valued back in the 1950s. It is kind of petered out now. Very few of the new political scientists
Yeah.
have this art anymore.
You recently mentioned in one of the last shows, you mentioned these previous great statesmen or famous statesmen. And of course, Kissinger is remembered as this statesman, who supposedly was very, very good at his job. You mentioned the Mr. Metternich, very famous guy back in the day, Clemens von Metternich, and this was the focus of Kissinger's, I think, doctoral thesis.
Yes.
Kissinger was very interested in that guy, and also Kissinger was learning about the Viscount Castlereagh from Britain, who was in the Privy Council. So he was into this older stuff, and I got into this older stuff as well over the last few years. And that kind of work that qualified him for what came next for him. So if people underestimate that old stuff, Kissinger made a career out of it. So he learned stuff. He learned some very important stuff. But the talent scout, really, for him was Fritz Kramer. He was also born in Germany and ultimately became senior civilian advisor to the Army Chief of Staff. He discovered Kissinger and also was close to Alexander Haig. So people call him the Kissinger's Kissinger. They call him the real Dr. Strangelove. So that was Fritz Kramer.
Yeah, and Fritz Kramer, by the way, was sort of Kissinger's boss, as I understand it, in the Army when it was
Yeah.
Sergeant Henry Kissinger in U.S. Army intelligence at the last days of World War II and during the occupation of Germany, in which I think Kissinger got to run a town in Germany, got to be the effective dictator or mayor of a town. Um, Kissinger's history in Germany is very curious because a leading British spy. The British acquired in the 1950s a spy codenamed Sniper. He was a Polish colonel general named Michael Golanowski.
Goleniewski.
Yeah, and Golanowski. Is that how you pronounce it in Polish?
I think it's Goleniewski, but I'm not 100%
Golanowski.
sure.
I think it's Golan. Yeah, it might be Golanowski. Anyway, however you pronounce it, he was a colonel general, which is pretty high up in military. I think there's only one more rank in military intelligence above that one. And he was an office mate with another Polish general who had a safe that had the names of the Rote Kapelle, the Red Orchestra agents recruited in Germany by the GRU at the end of World War II. And on this list, he memorized this list, this Galanovsky, and he escaped with it memorized. And among the names he memorized was a Sergeant Henry A. Kissinger.
Codename Bohr.
Codename Bohr, that's correct.
Yeah.
And so this is, and so now what's interesting is there's a book called, a number of books, but one book is called Henry Kissinger, Soviet Agent by Frank. I'm misremembering the last name. I didn't sleep too good last night. But anyway, in this book, what's fascinating is this detective goes over Kissinger's life from his behavior as a U.S. Army intelligence NCO in World War II in occupied Germany. And he describes Kissinger as basically his behavior is extremely narcissistic, ruthlessly selfish. And one of the key in his behavior in his career, but with his wife, he had because he was of a lower class background, and when he came to America, they were in the Jewish ghetto in here in, I think it was in New York.
Yeah.
His wife, when he suddenly was noted for his brilliance and he was coming up in academia, he realized that his wife was of a different class than the people he was interacting with and meeting with. And so he promptly dumped his wife. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Because she was of the same background as him, and he was trying to get rid of that background of who he really was. And that kind of explains Kissinger as a person.
Yeah, so he got his first real break in military intelligence, with the World War II. And so the United States military, they needed young men who spoke German real well.
Yes.
Or even knew Germany, had a German background, but they needed people who also were not loyal to Germany. So that's why if you had a refugee background, Jewish background, that just fit the bill perfectly. And so they had a special training camp. They called them the Ritchie Boys. So that's how Henry Kissinger got his first break. So this was just luck on his part.
In World War II, if you were German and you were thought to be too close to your old motherland, they'd send you to the Pacific Theater, or they would have you guarding POWs. And I knew a guy named Zimmerman who he was in the 2nd Armored Division, where a lot of his buddies got killed in the Battle of Normandy, and he didn't go. They didn't want him because of his German name.
Yeah.
So he stayed back in defended German POWs I think Tennessee.
Yeah, they did. So the counterintelligence corps, they not just did operations during the war. It was also in the post-war phase. When the last Nazi networks needed to be found, and you needed to debrief people. Yeah, the remaining structures, and you had to debrief people. You had to deal with all kinds of stuff, and so that was the CIC's work. And basically, they could have somebody in interrogation and tell him Well, essentially, there's two kinds of, there's two interrogation camps we can send you to. One is in Siberia, the other one is in the United States. So which one do you prefer? So it's either we ship you to the Russians, if you're important, and you're not cooperating, we can ship you to the Russians, or we can bring it to America. So which is it? And so the Ritchie boys, they were casting Henry Kissinger, and so this is when Kissinger met Fritz Kramer. Kramer was drafted.
Okay, what year did he meet Kramer?
Oh, it says Kramer was drafted, became a U.S. citizen, and joined the United States Army in 1943. He joined with 2 PhDs and 1 monocle, as they said.
Yeah, Kramer.
So he was one of the few thousand Ritchie boys. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge, battles of the Ruhr and Rhineland, earning a Battlefield Commission Bronze Star, etc., etc. And in 1944, he discovered young Henry Kissinger, whom Kramer had recruited into the Army division. And next, Kramer persuaded Kissinger to attend Harvard University. Now, of course, Kissinger was not really the warrior type. He wasn't physical enough. He always wanted to play soccer, but he was not good at it. And he was also not the type of guy you would use as a field agent in the CIA. Have him travel the world and meet clandestinely with sources and stuff because of his thick accent. I mean, if you can't even pass as an American, how can you pass as something else? He was not really destined to be a clandestine field agent, but he was sharp, so to say. He was kind of the academic. So that's how
by the way,
he was used.
In America in the 1970s, it was very odd that we had this Secretary of State with this thick German accent that some people could not even understand what he was saying.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And it's just, and particularly, there's not just one type of German. Okay. So there's like the baseline, type of German that everybody understands, but then every region sounds different. They use different grammar. And, he's from here. He was from this area. So it's almost like, it's you can't use him for anything.
Germany, is Bavarian German more guttural than other German?
It's just different. It's just very different, and it's also in this area. This is more in the north of the south, so to say. We're in the northern part or somewhat northern part of Bavaria. So it's its own thing. It sounds different, and so you can't use Kissinger as a field agent in the CIA, sending him around the world because he can't even sound American, let alone pretend to be something else.
And he probably can't sound properly German because his German is provincial, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen some people. I mean, I've seen all kinds of people speak German. Prince Philip speaking German almost flawlessly, I have to say. But some of his relatives, Prince Philip's relatives, or the Queen's relatives, they couldn't even properly pronounce their own names. I saw this documentary recently where somebody was trying to pronounce Schleswig-Holstein, Sonderburg, Glücksburg. That's their name. They don't live there anymore, but it's just, almost, right next to it. So they can't even.
Ein bisschen Deutsch.
they can't even pronounce their own names, so it's difficult. And for an agent, in a foreign posting, you have to sort of kind of nail it or be convincing enough. And so he was not suited for that. So he, this Fritz Kramer guy, he discovered Kissinger, Alexander Haig, James Schlesinger, Donald Rumsfeld, and Edward Lansdale. Okay, and the CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps, they were also running German politics after the war. I mean, there's a study out, I think it's from 2019 or 20. It's a fairly recent study by the United States Army, and they teach you sort of the history of the CIC and how many people they were running. So every important politician over here, the CIC was running for a long time. And then this study says, well, it looks like, we can't really tell if the CIA took them over. In some cases, it looks like it, but we're not the CIA. We can't really say. Yeah, so the network that Kissinger was building also extended to Germany. So who knows what how big his network was ultimately.
Well, he got a number of people he tried to staff in the CIA got caught as having communist connections and had to be kicked out.
Interesting.
And Kramer, Al Haig, the first deputy when Kissinger was. This is from General Palmer's book. General Palmer was the deputy commander of Material Assistance Command Vietnam, and in his book, The 20 Years' War, he has a particular interest in Kissinger's role in the war and Kramer. And it turns out when Kissinger became National Security Advisor, when Nixon came in, uh, they normally what they do is they give you an assistant, somebody appropriate
Yeah.
as National Security Advisor. They give you a military deputy, and Kissinger would have nothing of it. He wanted Al Haig Jr., who was
Yeah.
a colonel commanding a regiment in, I think, what was it, the Second American Infantry Division. And he wanted that particular man. And Kissinger didn't know him. It was Kramer who told him to get Haig.
Oops. Interesting.
And that's very interesting because, what is Kramer's background? And if you read between the lines in Palmer's book, Palmer was suspicious of both Kramer and Kissinger.
Yeah.
That Kissinger sabotaged the Vietnam War effort. So Kissinger actually would be calling up and bullying the generals in Vietnam and saying, when they would run a bombing mission, you can't do that. You can't bomb the North. You can't do this. You can't go there. And just absolutely threatening them.
Yeah.
Kissinger, behind closed doors, was always threatening military people. And they say that was it General Westmoreland, where they get in the book Apocalypse Now, and in the movie, which is based on The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. They've got the air mobile helicopter attack coming in with the Flight of the Valkyrie.
The music.
Well, they probably got that because General Westmoreland, the head of it wasn't General Abrams, sorry, who took over as the head of the Material Assistance Command Vietnam, would drink scotch and play that music blaringly loud every night to basically, cleanse his mind of the stress that Kissinger was giving him.
Oh boy.
This is the picture that Palmer paints of what Kissinger was doing to these guys. And just
imagine being bullied. Imagine being bullied by this nerd who was just a low-level CIC guy back in the day. And just this guy is bullying you around. That's so weird. That's so weird.
And there's another. I may have mentioned this before. H.R. Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff, who went to jail over Watergate. Haldeman wrote a book called The Ends of Power that came out in 1976, 77 maybe, 77. And this book, I read it right as soon as it came out because I read when I was in the 70s when I was a kid. I read everything on Nixon and those people in Watergate, so I was kind of into it. But what was fascinating in this book was the depiction of Kissinger. And of course, Haldeman, these guys like Haldeman and Ehrlichman, German names who were around Nixon, they were big guys, they were athletic, they were Republicans, and they were kind of bemused by Kissinger. They weren't sure exactly what to make out of him. And but Haldeman realized, and this is in his book, that every time Kissinger came into his office, he tried to read everything that was on Haldeman's desk. And so Kissinger would walk around and he would be eyeing, and it was like, well, Haldeman wasn't an idiot. He was pretty bright. Haldeman realized this. So Haldeman developed this strategy where he would just absentmindedly just move his coffee cup onto the document or something, a paperweight. He just and cover it up to just drive Kissinger nuts. And so that amusing, but the really disturbing thing, I think, in Haldeman's book, which was the big revelation which made headlines, was that Haldeman had alleged that Nixon put strategic bombers in the air, threatening to bomb the Soviet Union when because the Soviets were about to invade China.
Interesting.
And this was before the conspiracy and death of Lin Biao, or right about that same time. And of course, this is the idea that we actually were willing to go to nuclear war to defend China.
Mm-hmm.
Now Kissinger played a big role in this opening of China, and if you read the defector literature on the conspiracy and death of Lin Biao, what you will find out is that the reports that China gave about Lin Biao's death, trying to overthrow Mao and flee to the Soviet Union, were they were a lot of fabrications in that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the story kept evolving, it kept changing. But this happened right on the eve of Kissinger making that first trip to China, opening the way for Nixon in 1971. And of course, what was fascinating is that Lin Biao supposedly got on a plane after failing to overthrow Mao and fled to his bosses in the
Mm-hmm.
Soviet Union. And his plane was shot down over Mongolia, which is really
Mm-hmm.
Soviet territory, because Mongolia is a puppet state of Moscow. Well, I found out later when I met Colonel Stanislav Lunev knew someone who was at the crash site in Mongolia. And I asked him about it, and he said, well, everyone on the plane, on Lin Biao's plane, had been killed before they were put on the plane. The plane was flown over Mongolia and crashed there. It wasn't shot down. And the pilot parachuted out, was picked up on the border and taken back. That is what the Soviet investigation showed. Well, what's interesting is here's the Soviet Union being accused of trying to overthrow Mao, and that the mastermind, Lin Biao, the head of the People's Liberation Army, is cast as a Soviet agent, and it's a fabricated event, and the Russians know it, and they're not defending themselves.
Mm.
They're not saying this is fabricated. Lin Biao didn't try to escape to the Soviet Union. We weren't behind this. In other words, the Russians were helping convince the Nixon administration that they were going after China.
Yeah. So it's a great theater stage play.
Yeah, which puts the whole Sino-Soviet split into doubt.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And that, of course, that became a really big factor in Kissinger's work.
He's lauded for it.
Because I mean, I see two categories of Kissinger policies, essentially. To boil it down, one category is counterproductively harsh, and the other one is total utter appeasement. And both of these categories favored the Eastern Bloc. The Eastern Bloc profited from that. But if you don't pay attention enough, these two extremes, they could be marketed as, well, on the median, it's balanced statecraft. But no, it was either counterproductively harsh or it was total appeasement. So let's just move back a little. So Kissinger, he was a CIC guy. He was a Ritchie boy. He was he was a teacher at the European Command Intelligence School in Camp King for a while. And then Fritz Kramer tells him, you need to go to Harvard. You're a sharp kid. You're not good as a soldier, a combat soldier, and you won't be a clandestine, foreign posted, agent, but you're going to go to Harvard. Okay, so he goes to Harvard, and that was not the end of Kissinger's spy career. His mentor, or new mentor, became William Yandell Elliott. And pretty much everybody has forgotten about him, but he has been recently rediscovered by the historian Niall Ferguson. But I haven't yet read Ferguson's take on Elliott. Elliott was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and became an advisor from several United States presidents and presidential candidates, vice president, War Production Board, was with Roosevelt at the Conference of Yalta, also served in the National Security Council. So this is the new mentor, William Elliott, who graduated from Oxford. And of course, we know now that Britain was totally infiltrated by the communists, so that's not a good thing either. So Kissinger was working. Well, he was an advisor for the Psychological Strategy Board, Psychological Warfare, under the DoD and the CIA. And Kissinger was also running Harvard's Summer International Seminar. So they were looking for new talents, for politics, international politics, artists, and that sort of stuff. So it basically looks like a CIA type operation to find new politicians that were sympathetic to the United States, and you were hated communism basically. So this is something that Kissinger was tasked with, and he found the money, through these private foundations. And in 1967, some of these foundations were exposed in the press as being linked to the CIA. And then there was a document that popped up, which was from the FBI. This was a memo. So in 1953, Henry Kissinger called the FBI, and he told the FBI he had interesting information about some guy in the program. And it seems like Kissinger opened that guy's mail. Somebody who was in the program. So the same afternoon, an FBI special agent in charge was talking to Kissinger. And they were having this conversation, and then the memo, the FBI document says, we're undertaking steps to make Kissinger a confidential source, for the FBI, for the Bureau. And the press at the time suspected that Kissinger had been acting under the orders, basically, of William Yandell Elliott. So this is just, baseline stuff. Okay, let's just assume for a moment that, Kissinger had contacts at the FBI. If he's running this program, this, international program, it was his job to report suspicious people to the FBI, so to say. So his contacts are not the problem here. The problem is, as you mentioned, that not just one Soviet defector said Kissinger was a traitor, but it was two. It was Mikhail Goleniewski from Poland, and it was also Anatoly Golitsyn. They both said Kissinger was a traitor. And this was when Kissinger was not really famous yet. So with that in mind, of course it's a problem.
Now, do you know if this is, now I know in the history of Kissinger that he had a security clearance in the 1950s, and that security clearance was taken away. And I'm not sure, I'm thinking that it was taken away because of these reports from defectors. I think Golinovsky defected in 59. I'm trying to, and of course,
I think he was giving information during the 50s, but he physically defected in, what was it? I think I got it here.
He worked as a spy in the 50s, and he physically defected. I think it was 59, but I'm not remembering exactly.
Could have been.
But it was around that time that Kissinger's security, I think it was in 59, or maybe it was 60, Kissinger's security clearance was yanked. And it caused him a lot of problems. And in fact, it caused him problems when Nixon went to make him national security advisor. He couldn't pass, for whatever reason. I mean, this is all kind of hush-hush. He couldn't pass the normal security clearance procedures. And as a consequence, Nixon had to waive it for him.
But why would they go to these lengths? I mean, he was a nerd who worked for the CIC, and then he studied at Harvard, and studied some of these older things. But
Nixon went to the lengths because Nixon had this rivalry with the liberal Republican Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, who wanted to be a presidential candidate. He wanted to be president. The most he made it was vice president under Gerald Ford. But Nelson Rockefeller made an agreement in 1969 with Nixon to support Nixon for president. And part of the deal was that Nixon would take on Kissinger as his national security advisor. So Kissinger had attached himself to Rockefeller before this time. Of course, being from New York and Rockefeller being a New Yorker, it made sense that he had attached himself to the most prominent Republican politician in New York. But he was passed off to Nixon. And it's a very strange story, really, that he would be promoted in this way. I don't really know the deep background any more than this basic story, but it has always intrigued me.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Kissinger could have claimed that he wasn't really a traitor. He just, was acting kind of like a double agent and just pretended to, work for the Soviets or whatever. But there's been confirmed traitors of the highest order. So, I mean,
well, and it's not only the two defectors saying that Kissinger's a traitor. It's also the head of one of the top U.S. counterintelligence officials in 1977, Leonard McCoy. He was tasked with protecting a source we had in Moscow, a CIA recruited agent. And this was in January of 1977. Kissinger was still Secretary of State until Carter was sworn in. And he went to see Anatoly Dobrinin at the Soviet embassy in Moscow. And there was this effort on the part of McCoy to brief Kissinger and say, look, you can't say this and you can't say that. And you can't let them know we know about this because it will point to this guy that we have recruited. And Kissinger didn't even want to have the briefing. Kissinger evaded it. He went into the meeting. It was like a long meeting. It was many hours long. And he comes out, and this agent is arrested in Moscow after the Kissinger-Dobrinin meeting, and that's it. And McCoy was furious and actually made accusations towards Kissinger that Kissinger had intentionally given away our agent in Moscow. And I suspect that there may be other cases like this. But this is in the book Widows, if anybody wants to look it up, which Joseph Trento is one of the authors. I forget the other co-author's name. But this book goes into the Golinovsky accusation as well against Kissinger. And you know what Kissinger said? This is interesting. In a press conference, a journalist confronted Kissinger with the Polish military, the Polish general's accusation. And his rank was Colonel General, which is a rank, by the way, you have that in Germany. And it's a 3-star or a 2-star general, right? It depends on the, I've seen it as both in the Soviet army and the German army, right? I mean, Heinz Guderian was a colonel general. This is what the rank of an army, right? Yeah, serious guy. So this is a high level thing. So this is what Kissinger does. And Kissinger's a German speaker. He knows what this rank is, Colonel General, even though the Americans have never heard of this rank because we don't have Colonel Generals. We have Brigadier General and Major General and General of the Army and so on, but we don't have Colonel Generals. And lieutenant generals, but we don't have that. He at his press conference, somebody said Colonel General Golinovsky has said that you were recruited by the GRU in 1945, and Kissinger mockingly replied, "Colonel who?" Right? He demoted him in his answer, and I found that very interesting because you're talking about a general that has more than 1 star. This is not a low-level intelligence official. Generals are pretty rare to begin with, but generals with more than 1 star, you're getting really in the rarefied air there.
Yeah, and also, defectors. It's really dangerous to do that. And he's, Golinovsky, he's given information before the physical defection.
Right. Kissinger's not giving an honest answer. He's giving a mocking answer where he's attacking the other person as not being of sufficient rank to challenge him, essentially.
Interesting. So Kissinger's doctoral thesis So this was kind of his launching board into the higher, orbits of American foreign policy. So he because there are many people who want to go for the same, jobs. There's competition, right? So you get Americans with, long family histories, multi-generational military guys and intelligence guys, and families that have visited the same universities for generations. And here's this Kissinger nerd, and he didn't even grow up in America, and he qualifies himself with this doctoral thesis at Harvard. And what is he writing about? He was writing about Clemens von Metternich. Used to be really famous guy in Europe, when especially post Napoleon, when the different empires were figuring things out. And of course there's always the next war around the corner, and this was just a few decades before World War One. So very important time.
In fact, Metternich is in. I just read a very thick biography of Metternich, which has come out. Metternich was extremely important because his father was an important figure serving the Emperor of Austria, and they were administrators in Belgium, and of course in the French Revolution, they lost Belgium. The Holy Roman Empire was on its last legs, basically. The French Revolution and Napoleon put it under. And of course, Metternich ends up becoming ambassador to France with Napoleon being there. So he got to know Napoleon personally. Then he was ambassador in Berlin, got to know the Prussian monarch and the court there. So he got these are the two important, the other major German power, Prussia and of course France. And he got to know Napoleon's character, maybe better than anyone else. And Metternich is important because Metternich was an Anglophile. Metternich admired the English. He admired Edmund Burke. He had actually traveled to England and gone to London and was overawed by Parliament and by the institutions there and the culture there, the political culture especially. He just had tremendous, and he knew there was a kind of similarity in the political thinking between Austria and England, in that the Austrians also believed in mixed institutions and checks and balances, which people don't quite realize, that they had some very refined ideas, very sophisticated, and they studied many of the same ancient sources, Polybius on the Roman Constitution, which had affected the American Constitution. A lot of people don't even realize that Polybius's role in the U.S. Constitution. But Polybius is a Polybius fragment on the Roman Constitution, being a mixed system, a system of checks and balances, where the power is distributed in a certain way. And you see this in Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire, this patchwork. There was a kind of beauty to it, in that it preserved an older way of life. It preserved tradition. And there was a lot of sophistication in this German thought. And then when you threw the Enlightenment into it, there was also confusion, because there were people like Metternich's father who were trying to integrate the Enlightenment into the older thought and trying to realize some new synthesis was coming. Metternich, of course, was essential in the coalition that defeated Napoleon. He basically held it together. He and Castlereagh. Castlereagh was the British foreign minister who ended up working very closely with him, and the Congress of Vienna, which was really establishing the order in Europe that would last 100 years until World War I, was basically set up there. And the three great men of the time who really understood Napoleon and the situation were Castlereagh, Metternich, and Wellington, according to this biography I just read.
Yeah.
But so Metternich was a key designer who had these tremendous. Now he wasn't perfect. He made mistakes like anyone else, but he was a conservative, and this is what gets him a bad rap in history, being a conservative politically. But what he set up really lasted a long time. and preserve the peace of Europe. So there was never, his view was that there wasn't going to be again, it was checks and balances. There wasn't going to be a power that was going to emerge to do what Napoleon did in
Yeah.
Europe. And so here comes Kissinger in the nuclear age, and some of Kissinger's first books. I have one of his first books here, which is on the nuclear, strategy in the nuclear age. I forget the title, but it's about this idea of balance of power and nuclear weapons. Of course, Kissinger becomes famous because he's the guy that ends up negotiating things like the ABM Treaty,
Yeah.
the biological, advising Nixon to get rid of our biological weapons. And so he's trying to play this superpower balance game and justifying giving concessions to the Soviet Union because we're stronger and we need to make more of a balance, right?
Yeah. Also, you couldn't be a big statesman in the 1800s without intelligence work, obviously. And so there's at least one thing that we now know for sure about this thing we know about Clemens von Metternich. He was running an intelligence agency on German soil. It was called the Mainz Informationsbüro, and it was tasked with surveilling rebellious groups. So this could have been anything from radical Enlightenment guys, groups at the universities, or even socialist groups. So this
was located in Mainz?
No,
I think why it was called that?
No, it was. I think one of the headquarters was in Mainz. It was called the Mainz Informationsbüro, and it was. It had quite.
So it wasn't centered in Mainz. It just had that name.
It had a larger reach, and I'm trying to find literature. I mean, detailed literature on that thing. It's known that during the tumultuous events of 1848 here in Germany,
big revolutionary year.
This intelligence agency was almost about to be exposed, and so it was disbanded. Lots of files were destroyed. And so this is one of the things we know about Clemens von Metternich and his intelligence skill set. So he was at least running one, agency here on German soil. And
he was a very well-informed man.
Yeah, and this is something that people need to realize, that intelligence work didn't just start for real in the 20th century. It was even a thing in the past. And the thing is this: if you work, let's say you work for the CIA, right? You work at headquarters. This is the building. You go to work, you park your car in the parking lot, and you go through these gates, and you wave to your colleagues, and the people at the desk, and this is your workplace, and you have a general understanding of how large the agency is, and so on and so forth. But let's say in the 1800s in Europe, which was very chaotic, you had it's quite small, and you have this, very, very harsh competing empires here. If you were recruited back then to an intelligence network, you didn't know how big this network was. You didn't know who's truly running it. There was no official headquarters, and so you were left in the dark. So you could join a network, but you didn't really know much about the network. So if a trusted person with a high status was recruiting you, you wouldn't say no. But it's not like in today's world where you get a job, with the CIA, or let's say the MI5 or the MI6, and this is the office, this is the firm, this is your workplace. So this is why these intelligence agencies back then, they were oftentimes ad hoc. So you can create one, and when it was the right moment, you could disband it and move the important files somewhere else, burn the rest of the files, and just make this whole thing disappear. So this is how it was done. And there's another interesting connection with the family of Metternich. So because this is a quite large family, obviously, and there are many, many ties to Russia, Tsarist Russia, and there's also ties to the British throne as well. And we know Britain is compromised. You know, Britain was responsible for some of the worst intelligence failures in modern history because of the Russian and then especially communist infiltration. And so Catherine Belton released her book. It was called Putin's People. And there was this
I read that book.
Yeah, and there was this one little anecdote in it, and it said that it was about a very, very young Vladimir Putin visiting a castle in Germany. Not just any castle, it was a castle close to Wiesbaden, which was not too far away from a very important American military base in Germany. So this castle was the place of a Russian princess called Tatiana, and she married into this Metternich family. As her full name is Tatiana Hilarionovna, Princess of Metternich-Winneburg. She was born in St. Petersburg. When
did she marry into the Metternich family?
Hang on a sec. Let me just get the name real quick. This is actually a famous castle, and I think it was even Clemens von Metternich who got it as a reward, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, here she is, Tatiana von Metternich-Winneburg. She was born, 1914, according to which calendar, if you use the Russian one or the European one. She was born in 1914, and she married, hang on a sec.
So she was part of the white diaspora then?
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, she was tied to the Vasilchikov family, which was an aristocratic family in Russia.
Did she leave the Soviet Union? I mean, the revolution happened when she was 3 years old.
No, she fled. She and her family fled to Germany. She and her family fled to Germany when the revolution happened. In the 1930s, she worked for the Foreign Office in Berlin. Interesting.
The German Foreign Office.
The German Foreign Office, interesting. Because usually, foreign policy or diplomacy, German diplomacy is always, aristocratic people. It's always been like this.
Well, and they could use Russian speakers, right?
Yeah. So then they got, so then they got the Castle Johannisberg. This was the one they got. I think this is what even the famous Clemens Metternich received at some point. As he got it as a present. He got it exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Clemens von Metternich. He received it as a present. It was quite a reward.
Well, his family lost a lot in the French Revolution, in the wars, and the emperor was grateful to him for all he did. So he was compensated.
Yeah. And Clemens von Metternich even had the park changed to a British or English style. So this is what he wanted for this place. So he got it, and then it was it was handed down, in the family, the Metternich family, and at some point this Russian princess Tatiana, she married into the Metternich clan, and then she lived at that castle.
And Putin shows up there all of a sudden.
According to Catherine Belton in her book Putin's People, a young Vladimir Putin shows up at this castle talking to the Russian princess for whatever reason.
Very strange.
Yeah,
very strange. So you wonder. I mean, people. This is a funny thing. So maybe she was a spy during the war.
Yeah, and it gets
for her motherland,
because
maybe.
the family, yeah, because the Metternich family was so large, the thing becomes even
And
more
I can't
interesting.
imagine if the Metternich family had conservative members
Hmm.
that ended up opposing the Nazis too, or people who became Bolsheviks. Who knows?
Yeah, so
I just I don't know the history of the family then, but it's interesting that Kissinger used Metternich as his model for his balance of power politics themed way of
yeah,
doing things. Um, and it should be noted, uh, Kissinger's involvement, the Pentagon Papers here, Daniel Ellsberg
yeah.
in the 1960s. So are you about to get to him becoming National Security Advisor, or you got more on before he becomes that in the 60s?
No, that's just I was just looking up the last little note here because this is one thing I just wanted to mention real quick. It's yeah, so basically the Metternich family, they had all these connections, in Tsarist Russia, and the part of the family over here, the Metternich family over here, especially the descendants of Clemens von Metternich. But yeah, there's a tie to the house of Hohenlohe-Schillingsfürst, and there's a Prince Max Egon Hohenlohe-Langenburg. He worked for the Nazis, probably spied for the British. There's a good book on this by Carina Urbach about aristocratic spying during the Nazi era. And yeah, the Counts of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, they were tied to Sachsen-Gotha. And there's also this, all these links to these houses, the Sachsen-Sonderburg. So this is basically the British throne. So there's always, I mean, this is the reality in Europe. Espionage was ubiquitous, and there's always these weird aristocrats tied into this. So this is what Kissinger was really interested in, this kind of stuff. Yeah, yeah, after Nixon became president in 1969, Kissinger, of all people, becomes National Security Advisor, and then Vietnam and Cambodia happened. That was that. And so apparently it was not initially Kissinger's idea to have Operation Manu, the bombardment of Cambodia. At least this is how some historians see it nowadays. Not so sure about that. And supposedly Nixon was sure about this. He was really determined to have this Operation Manu bombing, and then Kissinger just agreed with it,
No, this is
supposedly.
when Kissinger's National Security Advisor to Nixon.
Yeah, so this is Operation
Yeah.
Manu.
Well,
And
let's go into his career with Nixon. Do you have anything on him becoming the National Security Advisor and the agreement with Rockefeller?
no.
Okay, so let's go into something interesting, and this is in different accounts, and this is in I think this is in Ehrlichman's book too. Not Ehrlichman, H.R. Haldeman's book. Um, you remember the White House plumbers,
Yeah.
and I actually had a conversation with the head of the White House plumbers years ago because he
Which
got interested in Galitzin. He read Galitzin's book.
was Hunt one of those guys?
Yeah, but the head of the plumbers was a former CIA security guy who knew Angleton and trying to remember his name. But uh, anyway, if you Google it, you'll see his name come up. Um, uh, what happened was is that Daniel Ellsberg, you remember the Pentagon
Gun
Papers got
Papers.
released. Now the Pentagon Papers, what it was is it was a bunch of academics like Daniel Ellsberg who were told, write a justification for the Vietnam War. Imagine you're a PhD or you're a master's degree person, and you got this Pentagon job, and they say, well, make up something about why we're there.
Yeah.
So you write, oh, we're there for the tungsten, and so these are just academics who are assigned by the Pentagon. They're just eggheads assigned by the Pentagon to write papers. And it doesn't necessarily mean anything because none of the people fighting the war, the generals or even Nixon or Johnson or the policymakers, they never read any of the Pentagon Papers. I would bet you
Yeah.
that Johnson, the whole Tuesday lunch club that ran the Vietnam War, none of them ever read the Pentagon Papers.
Yeah, because a lot of this think tank stuff is really just boring. It's there to
It's government make work, right?
yeah.
But when you read the Pentagon Papers, you're going, well, this is all very interesting, but to a conspiratorial left wing mind, where capitalists are, it's Smedley Butler's, war is a racket kind of
Hmm.
nonsense, because it's, oh, well, we're fighting the war for the tungsten so General Electric can make cheaper light bulbs, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, it's something like that. It's like we get tungsten from Vietnam. That's one of the things in the Pentagon Papers. So anyway, so this Pentagon paper story breaks. It's all this big news, and Nixon is like, he doesn't care. Why does Nixon not care? Because it was the Johnson administration that created all of it.
Hmm. Hmm.
It was a Nixon. Nixon said, "Well, that's Johnson's mess. That's not mine. I'm not worried about that." And so Kissinger goes to Nixon and says, "You have to care about this, Mr. President. They are doing this to you. You are
Hmm.
running the Vietnam War now. This is on you." So Kissinger, according to Haldeman, Kissinger got Nixon all riled up about the Pentagon Papers when Nixon didn't care about the Pentagon Papers. So then the White House Plumber Unit went and burglarized the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist,
Oh no.
to find out, which is completely stupid. I mean, why? I mean, again, Haldeman's like, why would they do that? Because it's like it's illegal, right?
Yeah.
It's breaking his confidentiality with his patient, and it's done to discredit Ellsberg. But why does? But you see, here's the real reason. You know who Ellsberg was mentored by, and who Ellsberg was a protege of?
I don't remember that case, but
Henry Kissinger.
oh God, really?
Daniel Ellsberg was a protege of Henry Kissinger.
What
So it
the
was Henry
heck?
Kissinger that wanted them to do this, to cover up that he had these connections to these leftists that would write these stupid papers and then have them leaked.
Uh-huh. Oh God. Hmm. Oh boy. Yeah. So
Pretty interesting.
interestingly,
So then when you get to Cambodia, and this is a pet peeve of mine about the Vietnam War. Look, let's make it clear to everybody. Vietnam War, Vietnam is a country shaped like a banana,
yeah.
right? And so in war, you have the DMZ right in the middle. So if you're going to attack, it's easy. You just block the DMZ and you put a bunch of artillery there, and nobody can come across it, get slaughtered. But no, you have this neighboring country called Cambodia that goes along the whole length of the
Mm,
banana. They have this thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail that comes down into Cambodia and goes all the way down to the Mekong Delta, down in the south. And so the army of North Vietnam could infiltrate troops and build supply bases all along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, all the way from the north at the DMZ, all the way to the south in the Mekong Delta, and have huge troop buildups in the jungles
yeah.
of Cambodia. So the Cambodian government knew that its jungles, this is very, very thick jungle terrain. They knew that whole armies, you know, multiple groups of divisions at each there was a giant series of bases by the Mekong Delta, by the Central Highlands, and in the north, and there were multiples of divisions, North Vietnamese army divisions,
Yeah.
tanks, everything in all of these bases ready to invade South Vietnam, not along the DMZ in the north, but along the whole length of this banana shaped. Imagine defending a country that's being attacked along its open flank
Yeah.
from the jungles of a neighboring country. So Cambodia, and see, the Cambodian government was scared to tell its own people. They knew that communist armies were moving through their jungles, and they were afraid to tell their own people. And they were afraid first of the government of falling, and of course it would destabilize them, and then their army would have to enter this war, which it eventually did. And so the Nixon administration very sensitively said, we have to push the communists out of Cambodia.
Mm,
So when Nixon ordered the the move into Cambodia to knock out these bases and of course it was difficult. The Cambodian military wasn't very strong for them to assist. This was we didn't want the communists to turn and take over Cambodia, right? So militarily, this is a difficult operation, required a lot of bombing. So what does the American left-wing media do? Nixon has committed the crime of bombing and invading Cambodia.
Yeah. 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 This was a
And of
joke. I
course,
mean,
Kissinger is, when you get to Seymour Hersh, who out of the My Lai massacre, you've got him, singing this song about how Nixon's widening the war and he's extended the war into Cambodia and now he's created, and so later when all these people, Cambodians, were killed by the Khmer Rouge, it was Nixon's fault that
yeah.
happened, right?
Yeah.
See how
Yeah.
twisted this is. This gets this propaganda thing. So this is one of my pet peeves about the history of the Vietnam War. And so Kissinger played this double game where he would pretend to be a liberal in front of the liberals and pretend to be conservative in front of the conservatives. He was a perfect chameleon, right? He's the great peacemaker. He's the one that's going to bring peace to the Middle East. And then, of course, we've got his intervention in the Yom Kippur War that basically supposedly stopped World War III because the Soviets were going to intervene on the side of the Egyptians when Egyptian Third Army got trapped in the Sinai during that war.
Yeah.
But no, go ahead. Now, what you were going to
So
say?
do you think what do you think was Kissinger's role in the outcome? The communists taking over in Cambodia. Do you think that this was just it just happened that way, or did he fudge something up?
This is a long-term question. They had the Paris peace talks. Now because of the negative publicity about the invasion of Cambodia, it became very complicated, and they did use some U.S. forces in this invasion of Cambodia, and certainly U.S. Bombing forces. And it was kind of our last hurrah of the U.S. military. And there were what was really weird is the North Vietnamese knew we were coming. So if you read an account of the actual campaign, they had set anti-air especially in the north part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they had set Russian anti-aircraft guns in the jungle at intervals. And they wiped out a whole bunch of Army of the Republic of Vietnam helicopters carrying troops and helicopter gunships. There was some disastrous things that happened in that invasion that hurt the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which largely carried out the operation. And so who let them know in advance what was going to happen? Knowledge of this was restricted to, I would assume, the president and his advisors, his close advisors, right? This is a problem for me, wondering how this, of course, the Russians have many intelligence sources, so you can't necessarily blame Kissinger, but I'm going to anyway, because he is so obviously culpable in the case of China. And now when you get to, so in 1971 is over, that whole thing with the Cambodian invasion is over. 1972, they get to keep the Ho Chi Minh Trail still there. We didn't succeed. And what happens is that they invade. In 1972, the Easter Offensive, I think it was April 1972, the North Vietnamese army just slams into South Vietnam from the flank. Now, Nixon had what he called Vietnamization, where he wanted the Americans not to be fighting, maybe giving air support. No American troops on the ground. We defended like Da Nang, important airfields that we operated out of. And we had some defense forces around Saigon. But for the most part, everything, the whole country was the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and they performed splendidly. They defeated the offensive. They drove it back with some U.S. air support. It was a little touch and go in the Central Highlands. There was a book written against an American who saved the Central Highlands called the Great Shining Lie or something like that, which was trying to paint this character, this American soldier who became very important in advising the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese. He was a very strong anti-communist American warrior. His name eludes me now. You remember his name if you hear it. They made a movie about him. They actually made a movie. And what's interesting is that Kissinger the whole time is going to Paris, the Paris peace talks, and negotiating with Lee Duc-Tho, who is the North Vietnamese foreign minister, and he is arranging the peace. And so, if you remember, in 1972, when this offensive is crushed, this communist offensive is crushed, and it becomes a Christmas bombing, Nixon starts bombing the North. And of course, how effective is this kind of bombing? I'm not sure it's very effective in terms of, it didn't cause Germany to surrender in World War II, and it didn't really cause North Vietnam to surrender. But supposedly the North Vietnamese cried uncle, but we had help supposedly now from our new friends in China, right? And so we had this agreement in it was 1973 Paris Peace Accords that that Russia and China were going to limit their support for the communists in North Vietnam. We were going to support, within certain limits, our allies in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and that was going to be like a frozen conflict, right? It was just going to end. Well, what happened is, because of Watergate, and that's another question of Kissinger's role in Watergate, especially because Al Haig was his assistant, and Al Haig took over as Nixon's chief of staff from H.R. Haldeman.
Yeah.
So here, Kissinger's protege becomes General Al Haig becomes Nixon's chief of staff. And many Watergate books will tell you that Haig was sort of the spider at the center of everything in terms of how that fell out and Nixon was forced out. Because now there's some evidence out that Nixon was railroaded, that it wasn't, there wasn't really a case against him, that it was sort of fabricated, that they didn't have it. But it was the perception that he was guilty and that he had done these horrible things. And so what happened is this peace agreement was extremely faulty. And Kissinger would cover himself by describing Lee Duc-Tho, his North Vietnamese counterpart, as, well, a little turd. I'll clean it up a little bit. And he would act like he was so frustrated and angry with Lee Duc-Tho, and he would even do this in press conferences and in front of other people. But he must have known he was negotiating with people who were liars and treaty breakers, because they broke so many. The communists always break their agreements. It's just sort of a rule of thumb.
Yeah.
And so what happened with when Watergate metastasized, and Nixon had to resign in, what was it, August of '74, I think, is when he resigned. You had, in the 1974 midterm elections, the Democrats, especially liberal left anti-war Democrats, got into Congress. It was an extremely liberal Congress. So in January of '75, when they come into office, because the election's '74, but they come into office in Congress at the beginning of January, they cut all the funding of the Vietnamese Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, so that by April, they were collapsing. They had no ammunition. They had no fuel to run their tanks and their helicopters and their jets. So Vietnam collapsed, and of course Cambodia, being militarily smaller, could not survive the communist takeover. So both countries, Cambodia and Vietnam, South Vietnam, collapsed. And there was a moment in whether or not President Ford was going to send troops to, emergency rush in, airlift troops, defend South Vietnam and repair the damage. Because the president would have the power to say, look, we're going to fund them again. We're going in again. We're not going to allow this to stand, because obviously the Russians, they broke the ceasefire agreement. They broke and which China and Russia had both signed on to. It was the communists, they broke it all together. And of course, this resulted in 3-4 million Cambodian deaths and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese deaths by the communist murder machine. But what did Kissinger do? What was his advice to President Ford? Oh, just let it go.
Just let it go.
Just let it go. It's done.
And then came the China chapter in Kissinger's career. So this was Well, first in 1971, two trips to China. First one was even a secret meeting. Prime Minister Zhou Enlai was handling foreign policy for China. And then there was this big meeting in 1972. Uh, Nixon, Mao, and the others, they were meeting and they decided to normalize the relations between the countries, because before, China, communist China, was not really accepted. It was not really formally recognized in many ways for a long time. So and then basically in the next year, in 73, there was a text published in the New York Times by David Rockefeller. And this is and Rockefeller, of course, he was hanging with Kissinger. They were really, really close for a long time. And David Rockefeller was talking about how great the social experiment has been in China under the leadership of Chairman Mao. These are Rockefeller's words. Social experiment, one of the most important and most successful in the history of mankind. Well, A, that's complete baloney. B, it's, China just copied the Soviet Russian model. And so this experiment had already failed in Russia earlier, and it was one of the worst experiments in mankind. And the Chinese repeated it with pretty much the same results. So, and then Rockefeller was talking about his impressions of China. He was talking about the feelings of national harmony. Whatever the price for the Chinese Revolution may have been, the revolution created a better system, a higher moral common goal, yada, yada, yada. Now the people, they have clothing and food and a roof over their heads. And so then he closes his piece with the following. He says, probably the Chinese are fascinated by our communist ways, and we just realized, or we just have to realize, that we ignored basically 1/4 of the world's population. So these Chinese people are our customers. That's what Rockefeller said. Now, at that time in 1973, the regime in China had virtually destroyed all meaningful opposition. You had multiple rounds of political cleansing operations. So exactly when the Chinese regime was securely in place, then, Rockefeller says we should trade with them. At a time when trade would not be able to really weaken the communist system over there. Interesting timing.
The cleansing of China, Mao takes over. Of course, there's initially purges of landlords and other people. And then by the late 1950s, you've got the Great Leap Forward and Let a Thousand Flowers Blossom. And you've got, of course, the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s with Lin Biao, Madame Mao, and Mao leading that, which is absolutely crushing. And they're using the young people as mobs of young people to terrorize adults, to terrorize other folks. And of course, this Mao, this biggest mass murderer in the history of humanity, is the one that Kissinger is going to open up relations with Nixon, and to get Nixon to go into a room and shake hands and be buddies with this guy.
Yeah.
This is Nixon's great achievement, but Kissinger was the spider behind it all, and of course, and this was all accomplished just on the eve of Nixon being destroyed himself, which is a whole story in itself. And that, again, you go to Al Haig Jr. and if you read as I did All the President's Men, and then the subsequent books written, of course, by the Woodward and Bernstein about Nixon's final days. I think the book was called The Final Days. It's quite obvious that their source for the final days had to be Haig,
Hmm.
because the only person that could have known all these details about, for example, Nixon walking up and down in the White House, talking drunk, out of his mind,
Yeah.
drunk, and talking to the presidents, having imaginary conversations
Conversations.
with the portraits of his predecessors. I mean, as I read it, I realized more and more I had the suspicion and this is when I was practically a teenager when this book came out. I was probably 18, 19 years old when the final days came out.
Hmm.
I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, who could have possibly, given them these stories?
Yeah.
It had to be someone that Nixon trusted. It had to be, and then who would have wanted to hurt the president? Because who was going to get power? Haig went on, when Nixon got pushed out, Haig went on to be the commander of NATO,
Hmm.
went on to be a 4-star general. And of course, you know who leaped him up from a colonel to a general? It was Kissinger, demanded
Interesting.
this promotion for him.
Was it?
Yeah.
Wasn't that Haig a Richie boy, or was that the father or something?
No, I don't know Haig's World War II history. I know that he had served a number of he served a diplomatic assignment in Yugoslavia, which was interesting. That he was I think a military attaché in Belgrade, but and he'd had some other sort of academic training assignments, but I don't know if he was in World War II.
Hang on a second. It says Alexander Meigs Haig Jr., born 1924, Secretary of State under Reagan.
He would have been in World War II, but
White House
what
stuff.
does it say? What his World War II record was?
Hang on a second. No, it says
I don't remember anything
no, he
about
was
his
going.
World War II record.
Well, he got scholarship, military academy, and on. Well, it's really started in the Korean War. He started in the Korean War, so that
Started in the
was
Korean War. Mhm.
yeah, and then later it
Yeah,
was Vietnam.
he was an infantry. With the earliest I can remember about him, other than his assignment, I think in Belgrade, was that he was the regimental commander of an infantry regiment in
Hmm.
one of America's most famous infantry divisions in Vietnam, and he was pulled right out of that on the advice of Kramer to give him to Kissinger,
Yeah.
which is interesting.
So some of we mentioned some of Kissinger's early friends, comrades, whatever you want to call them. These Richie boys, these characters from back in the old days, the counterintelligence corps. Hang on a sec. Let me just pull these up real quick. So we mentioned some of these people before. So Kissinger was scouted by Fritz Kramer, and Kramer also discovered some other guys, namely, hang on a second. Where is it? Here it is. So Kramer was not just discovering Kissinger. He also was scouting or had been influencing James Schlesinger, Donald Rumsfeld. So those two
Yeah,
guys.
Donald Rumsfeld is an interesting character that shows up. Donald Rumsfeld is kind of, in a way, as a congressman from, I think he's from Illinois, but I'm not sure which district. Rumsfeld was a champion of the Freedom of Information Act.
Hmm.
Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
Later Defense Secretary under Ford, and then Defense Secretary again under George H.W. Bush, which is kind of weird. It's like 20 20-something year break. And of course, his deputy was Cheney, later vice president under George H.W. Bush. Um, but there's some funny things about Rumsfeld.
Rumsfeld.
Yeah. He was definitely a power broker in the Republican security establishment.
Yeah, so we got Rumsfeld, we got James R. Schlesinger. He was Secretary of Defense. It was Secretary of Defense, and he served in some other capacities as well. So this was also kind of the old group, from back in the days, recruited by the same man. Schlesinger grew up in a Jewish family, visiting Germany, became a Lutheran, it says. Then he went to Harvard, worked for the Rand Corporation, then worked for the Nixon administration, became CIA director. Interesting.
Very, very briefly. He
Uh-huh.
didn't stay there long. He was told bad things about Angleton, but then when he met with Angleton, he was sort of persuaded that Angleton was right about things. But unfortunately, he was replaced by Colby, and Colby is a curious figure who ended up getting rid of Angleton with the connivance of Seymour Hersh.
With
Angleton was the famous
Hirsch?
head of the CIA
With the
counterintelligence
help
staff.
with the help of Hirsch?
Well, he leaked things to Hersh about Angleton being part of a joint CIA FBI letter opening. Correspondence between the Soviet Union and the United States was opened. And of course, this was technically illegal, but they'd been doing it for decades, right?
Yeah.
To make sure that the Russians weren't communicating with people. They never found anything by doing that because the Russians wouldn't be so dumb as to communicate with agents by mail. They had much better ways, secure ways of communicating with their agents, but somebody had established this, and Angleton, I think, had a kind of peripheral knowledge of it or involvement, and this was Seymour Hersh turned this into an occasion for giving Colby the reason to fire Angleton, and they basically ended up dissolving the counterintelligence staff, destroying their files. It was a disaster. From that point on, U.S. intelligence was blind because it was originally General Doolittle had been impressed by Angleton when they had discovered that the head of the CIA, General Walter Bedell Smith in 1953 actually, was a likely KGB agent. And so they had Eisenhower kind of talked him out of his job, got him to quit, promising him a better one at the time. But they had held hearings, and General Doolittle of the famous Doolittle raid on Tokyo was in charge with it. And Angleton had made the statement, look, the CIA is blind. We don't know our enemy. We don't have anybody dedicated to gathering all the data on our enemy and assessing our enemy and what is the mind of the enemy? What is he up to? What is it? How does he operate? How can we anticipate his moves? You needed a kind of a central brain to gather all the counterintelligence and intelligence information and process it properly in order for the CIA, the other branches of the CIA not to be caught afoul, because what was happening was that all these CIA operations the Russians were always one step ahead. They were always beating us. I think Guatemala and Iran were the only places we actually did anything that turned out right. And that might have been just a Maxwell Smart special, don't worry, Chief, it won't happen again. Missed it by that much. But the CIA was really horrible, and they had a horrible record, and it went all the way through the Bay of Pigs and the assassination of President Kennedy, when they bunglingly recruited a friend of Castro to assassinate Castro, and he promptly told Castro. This is all, covered in the extensive literature on the Kennedy assassination. But you see here we have these figures with Nixon playing a primary role. Kissinger playing a role. That it was Kissinger put the chill on Golitsyn. because
Really?
Gallitzin was saying that China was doing this fake split with Russia, that we had to beware that this was a game. Oh, Kissinger would not hear of that. So the pressure was coming from the White House to shut up that, make that awful defector Gallitzin go away.
Yeah.
So Gallitzin was persona non grata except for Angleton within the CIA because of the kind of political pressure that Nixon made. Just like Nixon put pressure on the generals in Vietnam, he put pressure on the CIA when there was any information coming up that was contrary to his design.
So it says in 1977, Kissinger left the government, when Jimmy Carter became president. And so
Yes.
When somebody is around for so long, like Kissinger, I mean, you could imagine he has built his own networks, he has his people around.
He's got
And
Lawrence Eagleburger in the State Department, who ended up running it, de facto running it later. You have of course Al Haig going up in the NATO command. You had Scowcroft go on to be the national security advisor of George H.W. Bush, and of course Scowcroft's protege Condoleezza Rice. Right, all fruit of the same poison tree.
yeah, so it's
The Kissinger tree. Yeah.
yeah, so that's kind of the thing that persisted because this is what right. So he was always visiting these Bilderberg conferences, for example, and sometimes they're in the United States, sometimes they're in Europe, and this was originally started by an aristocratic guy who wanted to foster this, Atlantic cooperation. And so they wanted to have, important people meeting once a year over a weekend in a luxurious hotel. And so they would listen to these presentations on various interesting topics. And so you would always have, let's say, the head of the NSA visiting Bilderberg. You would have people from important corporations visiting Bilderberg. And so they would listen to these presentations and they would go home and they would sort of be able to, talk about the consensus to others, just to coordinate some stuff. And we saw Kissinger all the time at Bilderberg. We also saw Rockefeller all the time at Bilderberg. And of course, the conventional conspiracy media, they talked about Bilderberg, and they did reports on Bilderberg, but it always either was billed as, what I call the windmills of Zion, the phantom, phantom lodge of Zion that doesn't exist. It was either that, or it sounded almost like the writings of Vladimir Lenin when he was complaining about, capitalism and all that. It was almost word for word Lenin's writings on imperialism and capitalism. This is almost word for word what the conspiracy media was saying. But when you looked a bit closer, corporations who sent their people to Bilderberg meetings, talking to Kissinger and Rockefeller, quite a few of them sold, interesting technology to the Eastern Bloc. For example, the German company of Siemens. Siemens, for example, they jump-started the steel production of China. Many people have forgotten about that because China was so stupid and primitive because of communism. And then magically,
incredibly primitive.
Yeah, and then magically, they were literally burning up all their forests. They were burning up all the wood they could find, and they had these primitive, almost prehistoric ovens to melt steel. And then came these companies, these corporations like Siemens from Germany, and they would sell these high-level, high-grade furnaces to the communists. And usually, if if there's a potential deal on the table, what these German politicians and these German business people will do is they will ask the Americans, is that okay? Or they just go ahead and they wait and see if the Americans start complaining. So this is just like the pipeline deals with the Russians. When people started, the intelligence people and the military people started asking questions about, underwater warfare and devices along the Nord Stream pipelines. And the response was in Germany, we never really thought about this because we always assumed if there was a problem, the Americans would talk to us and say there's a problem. So this is sort of the German mentality. You just do that stuff, if nobody's telling you no, if the Americans are not telling you no, you just go ahead, and if the Americans don't complain, you just continue to do that. And this is sort of...
It's very difficult to keep track of. Imagine trying to keep track of what several hundred different companies are doing every day.
Yeah, but it's just like...
It's really hard to do.
Yeah, but if you talk about these select corporations that, go to Bilderberg, I mean, the whole point of Bilderberg originally was we want to have transatlantic cooperation against communism. We want to bring America and Europe closer together and defend ourselves against communism. So why are these stupid
and the
companies?
Council on Foreign Relations, you got the same kind of deal, and it's going to include, and the Trilateral Commission. Look, these were to help. They really were to promote. People don't realize how much capitalists want to invest in things that are going to give them a good return. And when they look at a fallow soil like China, where it's been wrecked, where they could really do a lot of good as they see it, and they could build it up and make a good return, they say, well, why can't we get in there and do that? And you say, well, they're communists, they're enemies. Oh, let's get past that, right? As if you can't get past that. And this is the thing that Kissinger facilitated, was this. He was facilitating the desire for investment to go where it could make the best return, despite knowing full well that the communists were liars, that he would get on ABC News and he would say, oh, Lee Duc-Tho is a little turd, right? And that they lie and they cheat and they steal. He would admit that, but in private, he would tell these business people, oh yeah, invest in there. In fact, Kissinger and Associates was involved with investments in China and investments in Yugoslavia. And investments in African countries that, had socialist governments, let us say. And of course, we didn't touch on Kissinger facilitating the situation in Angola in 1975 when he was Secretary of State. But it's just such a long laundry list, and now we're getting to 2:00, so we should call it quits. But are there any final comments you'd like to make on Kissinger? RIP, rest in peace. I think that he has not. I didn't like all the praise that he got for China. It's like, praise? You mean so that China can now, build the biggest navy in the world and threaten us?
Yeah.
And where they're using the dollars that we've given them to try to break the back of our economy. Thank him for that. And their alliance with Russia, by the way, thank him for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that communists got advanced Western technology. It's also, as you mentioned, destroying the Western workforce. I mean, it's just like when Rockefeller had this thing in the New York Times in 1973 saying, "Oh, well, China will buy our stuff and they will become like us." I mean, it really destroyed. It really destroyed a lot of production in the United States and also in Europe. And what was the result of that? As a result of that, communists or leftists in America, they were using this as a way to further their own agenda and say, "Oh, look, you're not making that much money anymore, or the wages are not going up." And so the workers are unhappy, so that's why the workers should be voting left. I mean, this is just, it's just maniacally stupid. We gave communism these opportunities, and then we also gave them, a jumping board, a launching board on top of that to agitate over here and just to complain and basically use this Lenin playbook of whining, oh my God, look at the banks and look at the corporations. I mean, there used to be a time, I mean, this was during the Nazi era when the Nazi government, there's a really good book on that. I can't remember the title. I just covered it recently. When the Nazis tried to rebuild the German economy, they were crunching the numbers, and they were figuring out, we can't build a car. We cannot build a cheap car that people can actually afford. We will lose money on each car, and people still can't afford it. While the average American Americans, Americans were driving proper cars, and then they said, we can't build these apartments that are large enough for small families in Germany. And in America, the lowest paid guy, at the Ford Motor Company, the lowest paid guy at the Ford Motor Company can afford a 4-room apartment, with a proper kitchen, bathroom, hot water and central heating. So this is the lowest paid guy in America can afford a proper apartment, and we can't. And the Germans, they couldn't build something like this for the Germans. So that's kind of the difference, between those worlds.
Yeah.
Quite
well,
the
and of
difference.
course, Kissinger made all of it possible. I should mention that the Watergate, the head of the unfortunately named Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, was Jim McCord, who was one of the arrested White House plumbers, who went to jail. And I did talk to him about some of this 20 years ago. We had a mutual friend in common who got him to read Gallitzin's book, and he said, "Oh, I don't want to read that. Gallitzin and Nagelton, I don't respect him. I worked with him at the CIA." And then he read the book. He says, "Well, you're retired, Jim. Why don't you read it?" And so McCord read Gallitzin's book, and he called my friend Colonel Jensen back and said, "Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it's all true."
Oh no.
And
Oh no.
said, "Well, what do you mean it's all true? Gallitzin's right. It's all the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's all a staged thing. The Sino-Soviet split, the whole Nixon, everything in the Nixon administration did wrong." And of course, he'd been a CIA security guy, and he was just dumbfounded. And of course, my friend said, "Well, why don't you have connections in the intelligence community? Why don't you start doing something about this?" And it's like, oh no, I got in trouble in Watergate enough. And he said, "Well, will you talk to my friend Jeff Nyquist?" He agreed to talk to me, and I talked to him for over an hour. And I could understand what he went through was pretty horrific, and he was a very patriotic man. But again, when the Danielle Ellsberg thing happened, and they broke into the president's, Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, you start a pattern of illegal abuses, right? I mean, the Kennedys did it, Johnson did it, Roosevelt did it. They did these kind of things,
Yeah.
these dirty tricks. Presidents did it, and so Nixon's the one that's going to pay for it. I'm not sure how the orders were done to do something about it, and I didn't, he wasn't going to tell me, but presidents have power, and they can't get the bureaucracy to do what they want. They go outside the bureaucracy to get things done. And so, like the aristocratic world that you describe, it's all informal. They have their own spies, right? Well, Nixon couldn't get the FBI and the CIA to do what he wanted. So he had his own in-house group, right?
Yeah.
So, and he's not the first one. Almost all presidents have done the same thing. Whether it's right or not, that's another question. But why we have a president now, President Biden, who can take bribes openly, and his son's laptop can show all of this and nothing happens to him, and the former President Trump is prosecuted for a nothing burger? I don't understand.
Yeah.
I
think that Biden, once Joe Biden's son was working alongside CIA guys, I think it was Cofer Black, over in Ukraine years ago. And I think that once a guy like Hunter Biden, once he gets some sort of status in the intelligence world as a source, as something, I think that offers a guy like this a lot of protection, because he can always claim that, oh well, we did funnel some money to for operations and stuff, but of course nobody can really triple check on this what he did with the money, over in Ukraine and with his other business dealings. I think that quite a few politicians or quite a few of these guys or these operatives, they try to gain some sort of status with the intelligence agencies, especially foreign intelligence agencies, because that is a get out of jail free card. Oftentimes, if they get caught, it can sort of say, well, I did this because I had to, do this stuff or whatever, and I think that's kind of the reason these jobs are being sought after, or these positions are being sought, because there's always an excuse. I mean, you will almost never
I was
find.
the double agent the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, Kissinger. I mean, it's like, well, there's always he always has five explanations, and if one fails, then he goes over to the next one and the next one,
Or
and
he confuses your rank and makes you sound like a peon. It doesn't
yeah,
matter.
or he finds a fall guy, or there's like a fall guy who can take the blame, or there's some other thing, some obfuscation that can be done, and then people forget about the whole thing, and yeah,
Yeah, and
so
people have a short memory. They do.
yeah,
Well, Alex, thank you so much. This has been wonderful, and this has been another edition of Friends and Enemy. I'm Jeff Enemies, and I'm Jeff Nyquist with Alex Benesch in Germany, and I'm in the U.S. Thanks for joining us.